Welcome, and thank you for your interest in my work. Catherine Peel here, having created this presentation as a bit of a preview or introduction to my paper, which is admittedly quite unusual in its form, scope, and style. I also offer it to supplement any shorter versions of this introductory presentation that you may have seen me offer, for I'm excited to share this wonderful new science to unveil a new model of emotion that's been in research and development for quite some time. Indeed, this work is the result of a lengthy interdisciplinary journey, not only within and across the disciplines of psychology, but across the hard sciences as well, a journey through organic chemistry, biophysics, molecular biology, epigenetics, complexity, or system sciences, all of which was necessary to do justice to the puzzle of emotion. So I've done the heavy lifting, and the fruits of this labor are offered in the paper I'm sharing today, which is entitled Emotion, the Self-Regulatory Sense. Now, I'm going to unpack that for you in a minute, but let me be clear that my main purpose here is to entice you to read the paper, as well as to tell you what it says. I'll offer you the main ideas to put it in theoretical and personal context and explain the significance of the key figures and charts, as this paper requires a bit more thought and study than most. And for the sake of time, with little exception, I've chosen not to use references in this introductory synthesis, but rest assured, everything I say here will be covered in the paper's 12-page trove of references, and you're welcome to ask me about any specifics. As for its status, it will soon be published in Global Advances in Health and Medicine, but it was written for my original peers in the psych community, so I've made it widely available at the website emotionalsentience.com, and I invite you to take a look. But first, I'd like to say a quick word about science itself and the rationale for my interdisciplinary methodology, which might best be described as a systems approach. Like all social sciences, psychology, the study of human behavior, relies upon biology, specifically Darwinian theory, to validate itself as a science. We routinely look to the conditions of the ancient ancestral environment for clues about our hardwired behavioral regimes, our genetic legacy, and our neural architecture. In turn, biology stands on the shoulders of chemistry, wherein the behavior of molecular networks gives rise to the metabolic and genetic regulatory activity that makes all life possible. Chemistry relies upon physics, for all the bonding and anti-bonding chemical reactions that govern life are manifestations of the orderly and disorderly behavior of electrons in stable or excited states. Deeper still are the mathematical patterns that so accurately describe the behavior of matter in motion, with equations reflecting balances and their differential and integral nature reflecting ongoing change, and the positive and negative directions of that change that reflect a binary dance of opposites. For now, I'll say that any changes in these foundational sciences down below must be incorporated into those that rely upon them up above, and I suggest that this has not been the case for psychology, which is one reason that emotion remains so mysterious. In fact, we cannot understand the role of emotion in human behavior without examining the ongoing behavior of matter at all of these lower levels. In fact, the recent controversy over the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Psychiatry, reflects the deep need for better biophysical underpinnings to explain and diagnose mental disorders, also known as behavioral disorders, most of which are characterized, if not defined, by emotional dysfunction. This has long been my own opinion about the what goes wrong approach, ever since my initial interest in emotion took root. I found it premature at best to speak of emotional dysfunction when science had not even clearly established the function of emotion, something I had always experienced as a most positive force, a source of order in my own life. In fact, I should also confess at the outset to having membership in a uniquely eccentric gene pool, where the line between creativity and insanity can often blur. One that involves a particularly sensitive emotional countenance, which is likely the source of my calling to this work. And in my particular case, this sensitivity involves an additional bit of mirror image synesthesia, which is also known as emotional synesthesia. This is an overlap of emotion with some of the other sensory modalities, all of which are personal eccentricities that have helped inform my science. So for all these reasons, I made a choice early on to venture beyond the traditional domains of psychology whenever required, and to delve as deeply as necessary into the harder sciences to fully understand the order and disorder of the emotional system and its functional and dysfunctional nuances. A lonely, scary, risky, and costly decision, to be sure, but there was also an element of deterministic fate, as the sort of academic programs and structures required to do the job simply did not yet exist. Fortunately, along the way, I've encountered many wonderful mentors at all levels of the scientific hierarchy, so this paper is also a bit of a love letter to them, most particularly Marty Seligman, who resonated with my ideas about the central role of emotion in any sort of value system. He was patient when I argued that all three pillars of his new positive psychology movement were actually reducible to the first, to positive emotions. But I argued that negative emotions had a similarly important function, one which was crucial to understand and address the ethno-political conflict, which was the other initiative of his APA presidency. And he was perhaps amused when I argued that all of morality and every evaluative concept or word, good, bad, right, or wrong, was rooted in the experience of pleasure and pain, in emotion. Indeed, in the social sciences, values are simply assumed, which is a huge problem, for science itself has long steered clear of saying anything about values. Avoiding the naturalistic fallacy, you cannot get an ought from an is nearly as foundational to science as Occam's razor. The simplest theoretical explanations are the most desirable, which, by the way, this model, I think, does better than most. So my guiding question after those discussions was, what does positive really mean, or negative for that matter? Once we strip away all of our historical and cultural constructions, what does nature have to say about positive and negative? How can we really get from an is to an ought? And what does that mean in terms of the nature and function of emotion? So in essence, this work is really about bio-values, and the answers that I set forth in this paper in exquisite, if not excruciating, detail. I argue with even more force these days that values can only be found in the emotional system, encoded within the hedonic valence, the feel-good, feel-bad dimension of emotion and its coupled approach and avoid behaviors. The hedonic valence is also called affect in the emotion literature, but that term fails to include the motivational or behavioral components of emotion, which, as we will see, are crucial to understanding the original biological function. I also prefer the term hedonic for its moralistic undertones, addressing how so-called sinful or selfish behavior is actually self-regulated behavior with its own evaluative, indeed evolutionary logic. Non-negotiable logic, actually. I'll suggest also that the ancient function of emotion has remained opaque because we've been looking in the wrong place. The best evidence is to be found in brains, cellular membranes, rather than complex human or even animal brains. The answers that I set forth concern how values emerge from the impersonal ordering principles of nature, the attract-repel behavior of matter in motion, and how they eventually give rise to the very personal feelings of pleasure and pain in their coupled approach and avoid behaviors. They're to be found in a basement-level logic of binary computation, a digital switching control process like the 0-1 logos that drives our computers, and that directly gives rise to what I call the self-regulatory code within hedonic behavior. A pattern of behavior observable from the single-celled amoeba all the way to the complex human being. Again, I use the word hedonic very specifically here for the behavioral and moral implications, but just to be clear, the psychological definition of hedonism is simply the impulse to approach that which is pleasurable and to avoid that which is painful. In this, we are all hedonists, and as I will demonstrate, this is actually a very good thing. So with those general abstractions in mind, I now begin with a simpler, more concrete discussion. My hope is for you to reset your curiosity button on emotion, so please set aside everything you think you know about emotion so we can explore some brand new territory. A new way of thinking about, in fact, a new way of seeing the emotional system. In fact, paradigm shifts in science often come with new technology, new tools that help us see in new ways, like Galileo's telescope, allowing our vision to extend to much larger and further distances, or microscopes to peer into the realm of the very small. Now, even with mammoth computer-operated electron microscopes and gigantic quantum tunneling microscopes that allow us to see the atoms themselves, much of the new science that I cover is from these sorts of advances, particularly our ability to see molecular structures on cellular membranes up close and personal, and how, in terms of evolution, function follows form. But for psychologists and social scientists, I'd like you to think about this new model of emotion as a similar sort of visual tool, but a kaleidoscope actually, for there are plenty of isolated piles of evidence about emotions scattered across the various disciplines in the social sciences, but this new model allows us to turn the conceptual lens in just the right way, and then all the existing pieces fall into place in a brand new pattern. And most importantly, this new pattern, this new view of emotion, is also supported by hard evidence from the hard sciences. So with that said, today's objective is a quick broad stroke introduction to emotion, or perhaps a reintroduction is more accurate. So buckle up, we'll need to quickly leap mountaintops to glimpse this bigger picture, and hang on to your hats as it may turn a good deal of what we think we know upside down. But I challenge you also to test these ideas not only against your factual knowledge, but against your emotional experiences and their capacity for real-world problem solving, particularly any of us sensitive creative types. For that ability turns out to be a very good thing as well. So this talk is organized around 3 general take-home messages. 3 new ways to start thinking about emotion. First, that emotion is much bigger. I'm literally redefining it as a larger, more inclusive class of phenomena. Second, that emotion is much grander because it's rooted much deeper in our evolutionary history than we've yet supposed. And finally, that emotion is far more valuable than anything suggested by the old view. That understanding and harnessing emotion can bring profound social and personal benefits, once the intellectual dust settles anyway. The final section of this presentation, like the paper itself, will address the moral implications of this new view, offering some soundbite bombshells that I consider to be perhaps the most important offerings of the work. But first, to put this all into quick perspective, I offer a hypothetical scenario and a question. The scenario is this. Suppose tomorrow Microsoft or Apple, one of the big tech companies, rolled out a fabulous, futuristic new piece of technology, a handheld personal guidance gadget called the iWiz. The iWiz is 1,000 times better than an iPhone because it quite literally serves as a personal guidance system, drawing upon information from a seemingly infinite information base with parallel access all over the internet cloud, as well as tapped into the owner's unique genetic database, and offers up direct action strategies to immediately do the right thing, to make the right choice, to optimally right yourself in the face of any sort of challenge. It's really cool. It works like this. You carry it in your pocket, and as you go about your day, during crucial self-relevant moments, it rings out a signal with 3 levels of information encoded in that signal that provides exquisite and precise immediate behavioral guidance. It's a personal guidance system that keeps you on a right track of health, happiness, and self-actualization with magical wizardly precision. And it really works. It delivers on all of its hyped promises. On top of all that, it's reasonably priced. So now for the question, would you want one? I know I would. Well, of course I'm here to tell you that we already have one, gifted to us by natural selection, and it is emotion. Emotion is our personal guidance system, and once we understand how to read its signals, which do indeed contain 3 levels of information, it keeps us on track for optimal physical, mental, and spiritual health. Or in other words, emotion is our direct biological inroad into what Marty calls PERMA, his acronym for all the ingredients for an optimal life. Perhaps the most important message of all, in this new view, emotion is an entire sensory system. Now let me say that again, as it bears repeating. Emotion is a sense, an entire sense that science, indeed humanity, has not acknowledged as such. And like the absence or loss of any sense, we are quite literally disabled, functionally handicapped without it. But while this story may be new, emotion is not a new or a 6th sense, but perhaps the first sense to have emerged upon the evolutionary stage, a primary sensory motor mover, worthy of the name emotion, containing both a feeling and a behavioral movement. It is a sense serving the ancient function of self-regulation. The first experience of behavioral agency, the ability to feel as well as control one's movement in space and time. As such, it is a sense delivering the first perceptions of time, space, and self, or as Damasio put it, the feeling of what is happening, to which I would add, the feeling of what is happening to me, this body in motion. Most specifically, however, these first glimmers of feeling carried self-regulatory computations that others have called felt evaluations, the binary valence still encoded in what we experience as affective pleasure and pain. In other words, these first crude feelings offered digital 0-1 type stimulus signals that triggered a counterpart approach and avoid hedonic behavior, and in doing so delivered bio-values, those with universal meaning to all living systems. Now this is the missing piece, the formerly hidden level of emotional function. To this day, it provides the first level of information encoded in our modern-day emotional perceptions, perhaps the most important level of information at that. So understanding its ancient functional foundation allows us to recognize an amazingly elegant sensory system, delivering self-regulatory messages with every bit of the nuance and efficiency as the eye whiz, and more. Tragically, however, due to the powerfully aversive nature of negative emotion, pain, and avoidant responses, we blame the messenger and miss the meaning of the message. We fail to see how positive and negative emotions work together in elegant ways. And we blamed negative emotion quite literally for all the evils of humanity. Indeed, as we will see, the very notion of evil and sin are rooted in misunderstood negative emotion and its coupled fight or flight avoidant responses. So what I mean when I say emotion is much bigger, in this paper I'm panning back to see a bigger picture, broadening the conceptual boundaries of what we think emotion actually is, due to new and better science. For at present there is no agreement on a definition of emotion, let alone understanding its specific biological function. In fact, for those of you unfamiliar with the field, emotion theory is like the Sufi tale of the blind man and the elephant, each theorist having a hold of one of many different pieces, yet no theoretical vision to see the bigger whole. Worse, as academic disciplines continue to narrow, theorizing about emotion as a whole has, quote, gone out of style, unquote, as one prominent theorist once told me. Meanwhile, many academic careers have been built upon perpetuating ongoing controversies that to my mind are resolvable by looking to the harder sciences. In fact, as another prominent theorist put it, quote, science shouldn't work that way, but careers do, unquote. These attitudes seem to have taken root, reflected in such article titles as Emotion Generation or Emotion Regulation, 1 or 2, depending on your point of view. So with all due respect to the Academy itself, and I've had the privilege of hanging out at some of the best of them, my critique is that if inquiry has become about fashion, career building, and personal opinion, emotion science is surely in trouble. And as psychologists, some of the primary custodians of human nature as well as emotion, we can and we must do better. Now, I'm hardly alone in this sentiment. In fact, nearly 20 years ago, philosopher Paul Griffiths lamented, "The general concept of emotion is unlikely to be a useful concept in psychological theory," unquote. And he was right, but not because the inquiry was too general, but because it has been too fractured, specific, narrow, and anthropomorphic. So starting anew from a biological stance and one that remains tethered to common human experience, I'm literally redefining emotion, expanding its traditional parameters to include affect, in the orange ring here, also known as the hedonic valence of emotion, its feel-good, feel-bad, pleasure-pain dimension that we can all relate to, including its coupled approach-and-avoid behaviors, the motivational dimension omitted from the rather arbitrary definition of affect. My definition also enfolds Hans Selye's original categories of eustress and distress, so this new definition adds affect to the basic primary emotions shown here in yellow, which include joy, sadness, disgust, anger, and fear, all of which are hardwired and innate and with universal appraisal themes. And it also includes the complex emotions, shown here in green, which are personalized blends and shades of the primaries, also known in the literature as secondary emotions, unnatural emotions, intellectual, social, or moral emotions. These include feelings like trust or mistrust, pride, shame, admiration, envy, gratitude, contempt, love, hate. But going broader and deeper still in this new definition, I'm including biophysical feedback signals, shown in the outermost circle in red. These are what give rise to those first felt evaluations in living systems, and they're still at work regulating behavior via the hedonic valence in orange. Together, these dimensions give rise to the three levels of information encoded within each emotional perception. The messages that ring out and offer us precise guidance, once we understand how to read them. Note also that the color scheme from the large to small rings in the diagram also are stair steps from the oldest to the newest in terms of the triune structure of the brain. The new science shifts the focus onto the deepest regulatory centers of the brain. They're oldest because they're critical to all of life functions, all regulatory processes. So in sum, 3 levels of evolutionary complexity, 3 levels of information. Once we understand where affect comes from, biophysical feedback signals, which I'll explain momentarily. This is the missing piece set forth in my paper, that the affective valence is the result of regulatory feedback signals. While this idea itself is not new, all-time great emotion theorist Nico Freya is exactly right when he says there is no detailed hypothesis at the functional level that explains how innate affective stimuli invoke affect, unquote. And yet the hedonic valence is the unconditioned stimulus that underlies all Pavlovian conditioned and operant learning. So this new model not only gives a functional account of the emergence of hedonic behavior from feedback signals, but identifies the exact structures responsible for those feedback signals. So what this new model does, it allows us to see the big picture. The functional elephant of emotion is self-regulatory sensory feedback. All other emotion theories and many other seemingly unrelated phenomena make sense within this model. So what is feedback? In some of these graphics you'll see feedback depicted by curved arrows, as feedback is essentially a loop of information cycling between an organism and its environment, and information that is innately connected with stimulus response behavior. So what exactly is feedback information? We're all familiar with the interpersonal kind of feedback, the social kind, where someone reflects back to us or evaluates our performance to inform us of what we might not know or see about ourselves. Such social feedback can be good or it can be bad, positive or negative, right? And this kind of interpersonal feedback can reflect our various social positions, our balances of power, as well as our personal opinions and tastes. But in case it's not already obvious, I want to point out that the social, interpersonal variety of feedback is actually a more complex version of the intrapersonal feedback that underlies the emotional sense. Intrapersonal being within person, rather than interpersonal between person. For example, this bother scale that I found online, how much you bother me is really a function of my own emotional feelings. This is how we get the idea that others are good or bad, or perhaps even good and evil, because they make us feel good or bad, particularly if we apportion blame and posit intent on their part to do so. And yet, if I realize my feelings are self-regulatory sensory messages to me, from me, and about me, and they are telling me exactly what I should do in moments of opportunity or challenge, my feedback to you might be entirely different. So just a little teaser about how to use the emotional guidance. But first, let me introduce the system science take on feedback, the centerpiece of this new view of emotion, where the actual positive and negative evaluation starts, and what it really means. Here is figure 1 from my paper, the essence of a feedback loop. Shown here are 2 systems, one with feedback on the bottom and one without it on the top. The key idea is a bounded system, a system that exists within its external environment. In a system where transformations are always occurring, there are inputs and there are outputs as the system exchanges energy and information with its environment. The inputs are the result of the environment's influence on the system, and the outputs are the influence of the system on the environment. Input and output are separated by a duration in time, as in before and after, past or present. In every feedback loop, as the name suggests, information about the result of a transformation or action is sent back as input to this system. It's fed back in the form of input data. Those data are then used for both information and control, In other words, sensory stimulus and self-regulatory behavioral control or perceptual guidance. In fact, one of the founders of system science, Ross Ashby, created an electronic thinking machine based upon these principles, way back in 1948, that he called a homeostat. Perhaps one of the first forms of artificial intelligence, it provided a concrete example of feedback control. It combined both analog, which is graded information, and digital, which is binary information, and was able to adapt itself in the face of highly varied and challenging environmental perturbations. But he was way ahead of his time, and his homeostat was criticized as it wasn't anything like a brain, and that its learning was driven by arbitrary parameters and random chance, so it mostly ended up on a shelf. More on this in a moment. Nonetheless, feedback has become a central design principle in engineered control systems, like those used in the autopilot control of jets or guided missiles. We're talking about a guidance system, right? So the loop of information where the output is fed back into the system to serve as a new round of inputs, adding corrective adjustments along the way. And feedback control is found at all levels of a jet airplane, from switches to signal lights to the autopilot of the whole plane. Now this was likely this engineering model that inspired early cognitive psychologists to apply this thinking to humans. But the controller itself and all its feedback dynamics was in the brain or mind. This was intended to liberate the field from behaviorism, where the mind had become nothing but a mysterious and unknowable black box, where inputs were both environmental stimulus and the effects of the system's behavior on the environment, the disturbances, and that the outputs were the behavior itself. Specific to my model, hedonic approach and avoid behavior. Now this was intended to restore goal-seeking or purpose to the human being. But there were also serious problems with even the best cybernetic models, and these efforts failed as well. Still, the legacy was carried forth in a wedding of both the behaviorist and control models, finding its way into emotion theory, most notably in one of my favorite papers by Carver and Scheer, who noted that regulatory feedback was the origins of affect. And it yielded a self-regulatory arrangement likened to a thermostat, your home heater, for example. So the thermostat in your home heater works like this. It compares the actual temperature to the preset temperature, and then when a mismatch is detected, it triggers an auto-correction, turning the heat on or off. So these early systems-oriented cognitive psychologists were speculating that the earliest forms of mind, the controllers of behavior inside the murky black box, must be something like a thermostat. Some mechanism that accomplished goal-seeking and regulated stable homeostatic states using these three functional steps. The system compares something, the system, to the external environment. It signals when mismatches occur, and that signal triggers a self-corrective response that restores balance between the system and its environment. I offer the little image on the right as the inside of a thermostat, just to note that it's a simple electronic circuit. So adding a few linguistic nuances, we can think of the systemic comparison as the internal environments versus the external from the subjective perspective as simply a comparison between the self and the not-self, which shows up in the physical self-not-self distinction of the human immune system. This is where affect is actually rooted, as a bridge between the experience of eustress, pleasure, and distress, pain, and their underlying biophysical feedback signals, those key to the molecular regulatory networks. Note also that the signal comes in two types, positive or negative. Now this is really important because the control models largely failed because they only factored in one type. So what are the two types of feedback? Now both of which are required to couple together to make the thermostatic control arrangement. But like I said, only one was used. So in a feedback loop, Information is fed back into the system as part of the input for the next round of feedback, right? But both positive and negative concern the direction of the change, the positive loop going in the same direction as the previous iterative cycle, and negative feedback being a change in the reverse direction relative to the one before. So historically, negative feedback has been associated with homeostasis and stability as it reverses trends back to some preset or natural norm, while positive feedback is associated with chaos and runaway change, either in an amplification, more, or a blocking, less direction. Note that there's no evaluative judgment at all yet in these terms, for both positive and negative concern only the direction of the change, going forward in the same direction or going backward in reverse. But the new science shows how the thermostatic arrangement is actually born of couplings of both types of feedback. Indeed, individual positive and negative feedback loops can couple together in creating intricate feedback networks, chains, and circuits, observable in biological systems from genetic regulatory networks to neural networks and everywhere in between. I cite an article that sets forth the amazing functional motifs that result from these couplings, with functions like basal homeostat, threshold limiter, adaptation, born of negative loops, an amplifier, accelerator, damper, delayer, or bistable switching, born of positive loops coupled together, or pulse generators and oscillators, both. Of particular interest for our purposes is the motif of bistable switching, which is how the thermostat turns the heat on or off, right? So right here we have where positive feedback was left out of the thermostatic model. So here we have figures 3 and 4 in my paper, which demonstrate how positive and negative feedback couple together in an elegant stimulus-response relationship that facilitates most, if not all, of the functional motifs in one fell swoop. In a naturally elegant electronic circuitry that delivers the switching required for the information loops and regulatory control of the thermostat, homeostat, and rheostat, all of which have been described in the literature. So the bottom line is that feedback is a binary computational information processing engine in nature, central to the very concept of information itself, a concept rooted physically in the laws of thermodynamics. As Nobel laureate Manfred Eigen put it, if you ask, where does information come from and what is its meaning? The answer is, information generates itself in feedback loops, unquote. Indeed, feedback is central to the digital information processing in nature. Binary computations that give rise to Boolean logic gates, those that are the central components of electronic circuitry and the design principles of all of our electronic gadgets. This is the full-service feedback coupling I describe. That functions perhaps most like a NAND gate, which provides the self and not self comparison that shows up again in the human immune system. And the NAND gate is actually a primary universal logic gate, which alone can be used to reproduce all the other gates. And the feedback coupling I've described provides just such a service. So the computational information loops are ultimately rooted in the informing, self-organizing principles of matter in motion, those that yield the pattern building up and building down of physical form, the dialectic dance of order and disorder captured by the concept of the Tao in Eastern tradition. So in living systems, the noise of informing feedback loops has been harnessed to self-organize in stable form and regulate and maintain balances in order to postpone destructive, thermodynamically entropic sorts of change where energy is lost from the system, as well as to capitalize and enhance upon the life-giving negentropic sorts of changes where energy is gained and channeled creatively and productively. Take note that positive feedback is about change underway, usually more, or less of some stimulus condition, and that negative feedback is about stability, reversing an undesirable change, or going back to a natural favored state, an important part of all kinds of regulation. So this is the key to understanding how deeply affect is rooted in our biological self-regulatory processes. For affect, the hedonic valence, is both the signal and the correction in the black control cycle box. Binary positive feedback signals, feel good, feel bad, provide the digital information that triggers coupled approach or avoid behavioral self-corrections. So in sum, when I say that emotion is bigger, I mean a bigger definition, literally broadening the category of emotion to include affect, approach and avoid behaviors, and biophysical feedback signals that are actually distress and eustress signals. The latter are the biophysical substrates from whence all hedonic and emotional experiences emerge. Indeed, the empirical aspect of my argument is rooted in the hedonic behavior pattern itself, the tendency to approach that which is pleasurable and to avoid that which is painful, a pattern readily observable across living systems from the single-celled amoeba to the complex human being. So now, what do I mean by grandeur, the second new way to think about emotion? I've suggested that it is the first sense to have emerged, the grandfather of all senses, with its valence encoded in all the others, in visual aesthetics, acoustic resonance or dissonance, in pleasant or unpleasant aromas, and in warm fuzzy or cold prickly experiences of human touch, or empathic emotional contagion. This is because it is rooted much deeper in our evolutionary history than has yet been supposed. In the old view, the self, the mind, and all computation is located in the complex human brain, and while there are indeed many specialized structures, circuits, and processing pathways that are central to emotional experience to be found in the brain, they are actually much later chapters of a much older, longer storybook. But in the systems view, we can rewind that a bit, re-examining the self in a stripped-down way. Think of the self as equal to the system, a subjective center of stimulus, inputs, and response outputs, or simply the physical ground zero, sink, and source of energy exchange, whether or not there exists any experience of that stimulus or energy exchange. Think of relativity here, the perspective from inside a bounded system looking out onto an objective, external, not self environment. In this systems view, the self is the system as it undergoes ongoing transformations, state changes as it moves or transforms in time and space. It matters not whether that self is an atom, a molecule, a cell, an organ tissue, or an organism. It also is its own self-system existing in its not-self environment. The self is even more elegant in terms of complex systems theory, for complex systems are fractal structures. Fractals are natural geometric shapes exhibiting organization on both horizontal and vertical dimensions, with both bottom-up and top-down regulatory pathways. They are characterized by self-similarity across all levels of scale, nested hierarchies of self-repeating part-to-whole relationships, likened to a set of Russian nesting dolls. This is a geometry that is literally driven by iterative feedback cycles. The brain itself is a fractal structure, but in terms of identity boundaries, any complex self-system is a multidimensional fractal, being at once a network node, a self-contained module within a locally linked network cluster, and via its global connections also bounded by the entire structure. So there's 3 levels of identity here in a fractal. Or, in terms of the Russian nesting dolls, each doll is a self interacting with its larger external not-self environment. The next biggest doll, whether it knows that it's part of it or not, is just doing its thing within, which together provides global self-regulatory coordination due to the stimulus response local control that we've described. The entire network is replete with ongoing signal transduction cascades, the self-regulatory music of the body, as I call it, all of which comes courtesy to us via our self-regulatory sense, emerging in our consciousness as an emotional perception. Now that may sound very abstract and confusing, so let's get more concrete. Fortunately, sentience begins in brains, cellular membranes, way before the brains or nerve nets ever emerged on the evolutionary stage. By examining the sensory mechanisms of the most primitive life forms, we can separate primary sentience from complex human cognition and perception, and yet still see a clear evolutionary path between them. Indeed, we see these feedback processes in action at the molecular level, as well as their structures that evolved to facilitate them. So in my paper, I've mapped the molecular sensory motor circuitry of the E. coli bacterium to demonstrate the emergence and logic of hedonic behavior. Indeed, these feedback computations are bridges between the fully determined happenings of matter in motion and the partially free doing behavior of living systems, honoring favored states of thermodynamic balance in nature. Bio-values having to do with the conditions for life itself: sunlight, water, oxygen, heat, caloric intake, pH balance for metabolism, and the ability to respond and move about under one's own steam. Put another way, this is how thermodynamics gives rise to morphodynamics and teleodynamics. Together with the physical forces, gravity and electromagnetism, the laws of thermodynamics, which are about energy exchange and favored balances and equilibrium states, give rise to morphodynamics, which is about dynamic shape-shifting, shapes that flow naturally from the attract-repel nature of charged particles, shapes that have been favored by natural selections, shapes that facilitate certain biological functions, like the conformational foldings of proteins, for example, or the spiral structure of self-replicating molecules like DNA. For in biology, function does indeed follow form. Or, put still another way, this is how we get from is to ought. Whoops, sorry. This is how we get from is to ought. So, with that said, in my paper, I've mapped the sensory motor circuitry of the E. coli bacterium, the same circuitry that drives its hedonic approach and avoid behavior. Now, this sense was originally called chemotaxis, as it allowed the bug to respond to good or bad chemicals in its environment, to food or poison. But the same system is better described as infotaxis, as it also distinguishes. Oh yeah, it can also distinguish and respond to temperature shifts, to oxygen levels and pH balance, and even to the ongoing changes in nanoscale electromagnetic fields, all of which were called thermotaxis, aerotaxis, osmotaxis, and phototaxis respectively in the literatures, and all of which are sensory abilities that allow it to regulate its metabolism, to satisfy its needs, its energetic requirements, all of which are required to live. So the authors who coined the term infotaxis described this circuitry that allows the bacterium to zero in on, quote, information that accumulates as entropy decreases, unquote, a process to my mind that can best be likened to a child's game of hot beans. You are getting colder, you are getting warmer, and which hedonic response approach and avoid is driven. So what this means in the most general sense is that the feedback circuitry builds a symbolic evaluative system that allows the bug to distinguish between goodies and baddies in its local environment, and to move toward the goodies and away from the baddies. Hedonic behavior, right? This is accomplished by an exquisite network of 5 genes and the feedback relationships of their protein products. There are 3 levels of these relationships, each of which offers an elegant example of the feedback, the universal feedback coupling that goes on inside the black box. So without going into too much detail, I want to call attention to the wizardry of the simple molecular circuitry and how the 3 levels of binary switching forges complexity from the original positive and negative feedback to stop and go behavior, and finally to the yes-no hedonic logic, the goodies and the baddies of infotaxis. So here we have figure 5 from the paper, which to my mind is of quite profound significance, something I call the tit-for-tat code, the self-regulatory logic within the hedonic valence of emotion. So far, the part of this circuit that I've described is driven by simple diffusion and stochastic, random, chemical fluctuations, the thermodynamically lawful happenings. the simple environmental inputs and outputs where the system rebalances to a favored thermostatic state via negative feedback alone. But there is an additional feed-forward loop in the final level of the system that serves as an online memory that allows the bug to choose between a positive or negative feedback response, as well as to anticipate, prefer, and deliberately choose optimal, beneficial sorts of change. So the simple operational logic is this. If a positive stimulus, simply choose a positive feedback response, more, more, more. If a negative stimulus, simply choose a negative feedback response, reversing the direction to stop the change. Very simple, very elegant, very universal. This is exactly what the E. coli does, literally reversing the direction of motion by reversing the rotational direction of his little flagella, the tail that propels them through the environment. Here we have figure 6, one of the last charts I'll bother you with. And this is the depiction of the black box where the comparison, signal, and self-correction occurs, all of which is accomplished by the molecular circuitry we just discussed. The first, crude mind. Note that the binary signal is perceived, the binary signal is perceived, the comparison is the tit-for-tat code, which then triggers the optimal self-corrective behavior. This is the molecular dynamics of affect. It's also the source of adaptive learning through trial and error feedback and all higher level conditioned learning effects. Indeed, this is of key significance because the ability to distinguish between the binary poles of the signal itself is the emergence of sensory perception. Likewise, it's the emergence of choice making, the ability to choose between an approach and avoid bistable response. It's nothing less than the emergence of free will. These are the felt evaluations, the bridge to agency and goal-seeking, to teleodynamics, all of which was forged by the earliest living systems. In short, the ability to sense the difference between good for me or bad for me is the final step to genuine hedonics of the emotional sense. This molecular feedback configuration yields, quite literally, the first crude mind. So what is the sense organ here? What is the structure that accomplishes this genuine wonder of nature and houses the emergent mind? The E. coli has nothing like a brain. Ah, but it has a brain, B-R-A-N-E, a cellular membrane, with which the new microscopic technology has turned out to be far more complex and elegant than we suspected. Indeed, the key structure here is the cellular membrane receptor complex, a bundle of dynamic proteins that accomplishes all of the feats we've just described. Shown here rather simplistically in the little orange bundles that traverse the green membrane, but a closer look reveals them to be far more complex. Indeed, our old view of the cellular receptor was conceptualized as a simple lock and key, where a chemical stimulus came along, sat down on a receptor, and a particular response would occur. Now we recognize them as intricate tangled bundles of various proteins functioning like complex feedback circuits with toggle switches, logic gates, and elegant regulatory dynamics. Instead of one receptor lock per stimulus key, we now understand them as dynamic clusters that flow and change constantly. Indeed, the E. coli receptor complex has tens of thousands of protein receptors that cooperatively cluster together by a process of stochastic self-assembly into a sensory organ likened to a nose. But these sorts of receptor complexes exist on all cells, and they accomplish not only self-regulatory functions, but they foster horizontal cell-to-cell communication and are the key players in all signal transduction cascades across the human body. They increase in complexity in eukaryotic and mammalian cells, of course, but they operate on the very same design principles. The neurons of the central nervous system, on the other hand, are newer and fancier still. They're much more specialized cells of the more complex global regulatory functions, operating more like rows of multiple switches and panels of circuits, forging brain circuitry that regulate the top-down, feed-forward dimension of self-correction. But they too have such clusters, receptor clusters, on their membranes known as microdomains or lipid rafts that still serve these original biological functions. In fact, the dendrites themselves of a neuron perform computations of similar sophistication to those of the E. coli bacterium, where they count and keep a running tally of the various local synaptic inputs. Inside the dendritic Indeed, the dendritic spines on neurons are suspiciously similar in size, form, and function to the bacterium, and digital biologist Dennis Bray hints some similar single-celled organism way back when may have become an early symbiont, as did our mitochondria, giving rise to the neuron itself. What I found most illuminating about this receptor complex, however, was that its structure has components akin to heads and tails, where the heads are projections located outside the cell into the extracellular environment, outside the boundary of the system. But the complex also has tails that project into the inside of the cell, into the intracellular environment. This is how the ongoing self-regulatory comparison can be made, the NAND gate, right? With the original stimulus attaching to the heads of the receptors, which initiates a series of events that add or subtract phosphate groups, methyl groups, or some other messenger molecule to the tails of the complex insides, where also then second, third, or fourth messenger molecules carry out a wide variety of self-regulatory functions inside the cell in response to a wide variety of external environmental stimulus. Memory in the E. coli system, for example, happens by adding methyl groups to these tails. More methyl groups means more stimulus, less methyl groups for less, or something like that. Maintaining a running account of stimulus increases and decreases. It might be reversed. At this moment, I don't have it in front of me. But it's elegant in that it's a one-to-one match between what's going on outside with the stimulus. So, certain combinations of stimulus events can also trigger a shape shift in the receptor complex itself that toggles the receptor into one shape or another, adding additional functional complexity to its services. In complex human cells, there are ever more internal messages as well added to the system, signaling substances that are hard at work regulating processes over wide varieties of scales and time across the entire fractal human organism. These include transcription factors, microRNAs, kinases, neuropeptides, and hormones, neurotransmitters, of course, that are now serving as stimulus signals themselves in both intra and extra cellular environments. MicroRNAs, for example, being another key player in neural processing and top-down epigenetic switching. In short, the original information processing machinery on the brain of the earliest living systems remains a local integral part of our much more complex and elegant system-wide regulatory machinery, all of which maintains global coherence and bodily integrity, the very source of the self-regulatory music of the body. So we've come full circle back to Ashby's original homeostat. That was the one that was criticized as not being brain-like, and that its adaptive learning was based on randomness or entropy. But it is the membrane, the B-R-A-N-E, not the brain, that does all of this, that yields this first thinking machine in nature. So Ashby actually had it right with his early homeostat. For the cellular receptor complex provides all of those services and more. It is not only analogous in function, it is homologous in structure to his simple electronic circuitry. So let me emphasize again that it is the emotional feedback coupling, the universal logic gate that yields self-regulated stimulus response behavior, and how we get from there to the origins of affect and to emotive self-regulatory behavior. Likewise, we've come full circle to the sweeping evidence from behaviorism concerning the unconditioned rewards and punishments that underlie all conscious and conditioned learning. In sum, hedonic behavior is self-regulated behavior, where its ancient logic, along with its feedback design components, have been conserved throughout our entire evolutionary history. But emotion is not only bigger and grander for these reasons, it is far more valuable than the old science suggests. For as I mentioned, we've largely blamed the messenger while missing the self-regulatory messages. For while emotion remains an undefined mystery scientifically, preemptive negative judgments about it are everywhere, even in science. All the clues are there, but emotion is considered primitive, if not bad stuff. For example, the cover of Discover magazine as recently as 2002. Notice the feedback arrows. They get that. They even use the language of sensation. But the headline reads, "Can the brain conquer fear? Primitive brain senses fear. Modern brain battles with primitive brain for control." And my personal favorite, "Neuroscientists explore ways to keep emotion from hijacking the mind." When I saw that, I thought, oh my, we'd never speak so slanderously about the information offered by any of our other senses. Neuroscientists explore ways to keep color from hijacking the mind, or sound from hijacking the mind. But this attitude has caused us to miss out on all three levels of the information encoded in emotion. It's crazy, but we clearly blame the messenger attempting to suppressively regulate and overpower our emotions when they're in fact actually regulating and empowering us from a much deeper, wiser evolutionary rationale. But the habit of blaming emotion runs very deep. The pejorative judgment is ironically shot through our entire religious traditions, and we have quite literally blamed emotion for all the evils of the world. For example, 5 out of the 7 deadly sins are emotions themselves. Greed, envy, lust, wrath, pride, and all the so-called sins concern emotional self-regulatory processes gone awry. Sloth, for example, could also be a manifestation of the epidemic levels of depression and gluttony, not to mention all addictions of every variety can be born of suppressive emotional coping. Doing something to make us feel immediate pleasure to mask ongoing suffering of our own making. Instead of understanding and honoring its self-regulatory function, we're taught that selfishness is bad and selflessness to the point of martyrdom and is good. And hedonism is practically a dirty word. But this is also the case for our Eastern religions. We see the same themes there, albeit perhaps less pernicious. In Buddhism, for example, craving and aversion, the hedonic valence, are cited as sources of all human suffering, and the righteous path is to transcend the delusions of the self. So they're acknowledging the self-centric nature of emotion, but not its valuable self-regulatory function, and they seek to transcend, detach from, or otherwise efface the self. So this pejorative strand of thinking is also woven through our science. Our very genes are selfish, and therefore human nature by genetic decree is self-serving, competitive, and deterministically rotten to the core. Okay, I'm exaggerating a little, but I do so because these assumptions are like second nature, and I believe them to be unfounded and profoundly mistaken. Because the new science suggests that selfish equals self-relevant. Deeply important information about ongoing self-regulatory processes that we can help or hinder. Indeed, with the revelations from the new field of epigenetics, the frozen, reactive, selfish gene scenario, with meaning only in ancient ancestral environments, has given way to the view of the more fluid, proactive, self-regulating genome that operates in a constant, ongoing, here and now, interactive dance with the local environment. With microRNA and supposedly junk DNA literally switching genes on and off in response to physical, chemical, and even social environmental context. Like every self-regulating cell in our bodies, we are complex, fractal, self-regulating systems born of a mathematically fractal, lawfully self-organizing universe. So self-relevance not only runs deep, but is central to our immune functioning, its self and not self distinction providing the bidirectional link between emotion and physical health. Recall that I mentioned affect was one and the same with what stress pioneer Hans Selye called distress and eustress, both good and bad kinds of environmental stressors, the good kind clearly having been lost somewhere along the line. We know now that epigenetic switching yields critical modifications during cellular stress responses, and that even the formation of the optimal neural circuitry in a developing child can be derailed by ongoing environmental stressors. This new work is known as stress genomics or social neuroscience, both of which acknowledges a social nervous system with tremendous sensitivity to the environmental conditions. Across the literature, this mechanism of environmental bedding has been noted in myriad physiological aspects of emotion, including the vagal tone responses of the heart. It has borne many labels, many names: sensitivity to context, time-dependent sensitization, neural sensitization, sensor hyperactive arousal, and central sensitization. But by any name, all reflect the self-regulatory dynamics of the emotional sense. And whether we like it or not, the human capacity for this sensitivity to context seems to be increasing. In its intimate relationship with epigenetic switching and neural development has been noted in developmental disorders such as autism and schizophrenia. It's also been noticed in the uprise in chemical sensitivities, in immune responses as well. The upside, however, is that such sensitive children who grow up in optimal environments have even better developmental outcomes than their less sensitive peers. So if feedback processes provide links all the way from the mathematically precise deterministic physics to our physical well-being and even our higher concepts of morality, why would awareness of eustress and distress be so important? Why? What is the basement language that makes our felt evaluation so valuable? What is the ultimate biological meaning of positive and negative emotion? What answer can I finally give Marty? Now this is figure number 7 from my paper, the holy grail of positive and negative, which demonstrates how the yes, no, and the feel good, feel bad meaning within the hedonic valence explains innate positivity and negativity, and provides the first level of information encoded in emotion. This is what happens when we follow the tit-for-tat code. This is what happens when we make corrective changes that encourage and increase more good stuff or discourage and decrease the bad stuff. The answer is that the tit-for-tat code subserves two evolutionary attractors, imperatives, or purposes, if you will. These are non-negotiable imperatives, and as they concern the very logic of natural selection. Or in other words, it is through the emotional sense that we participate in our very evolution. Indeed, the messages encoded in pleasure and pain relate directly to these two evolutionary, self-regulatory purposes. Painful feelings are messages about self-preservation, and pleasurable feelings are messages about mindful self-development. So we're talking about physical self-preservation and mindful self-development, two right and good self-regulatory imperatives. If this sounds anticlimactic, think about it. Because life emerged and evolved because this core sensory system delivered a subjective reflection of the criteria for natural selection, survival, and adaptation. It is through our self-regulated behavior that organisms have been active here and now participants in the very evolutionary process since life emerged. Now this is a far cry from the notion that adaptation only occurs through random genetic mutation, or that all of human behavior and consciousness is meaningless beyond sexual reproduction. These are central themes in the old story, themes that negate everything human about us. Indeed, until the discovery of epigenetic mechanisms, the entire dimension of adaptive self-development has been left out of evolutionary theory, just as positive and optimal development has been left out of psychology. But this extends to the moral dimension of value as well, because there remains one universal moral imperative for all living systems, the tit-for-tat code, to simply reduce the environmental conditions that elicit the distressing basic pains, and increase those that elicit eustress, the complex pleasures. Now this is the foundational message of positive and negative emotions, and it remains the same despite the subsequent eons of added evolutionary complexity. So here we have the final chart in my paper, which is the key to decoding the present-day emotional perceptions. Indeed, over our sweeping evolutionary history, the simple two-step stimulus response system has expanded into a 5-step cycle. with both the original bottom-up feedback and the new top-down feed-forward add-ons. 3 new steps that constitute the conscious mind, prefrontal executive regions. Those that have been captured in the dual process models. So the cycle works like this. It starts with motives. Whether conscious goals or conditioned or habitual behavioral responses or strategies, these motives drive actions. The actions, of course, are intended to accomplish these goals, to satisfy these needs, to serve these drives. And these actions, of course, lead to outcomes. But these outcomes are the mind's interpretation of the results of one's actions. For these first 3 steps are the add-ons of the mind. Now, the mind's perception of the outcome can have perceptual filters, biases, and distortions that we're all very familiar with as psychologists. So this is where the evaluation, which is the original 2-step evaluation and correction, are still there in the original feedback evaluation and hedonic evaluation, because it keeps the mind honest. Okay? So we perceive one thing, and then the emotional evaluation comes on the heels to tell you how accurate that comparison is between the mind and the actual perceptions of the body. Then, of course, those evaluations trigger those original approach and avoid self-corrections, just like they always have since the very beginning. But in humans, the correction is conditioned, it's fed forward, as we will see, into the mindscape in an automatic process that underlies Pavlovian conditioning. So in this chart, well, obviously there's very much more to say about decoding and using the emotional messages. This beyond the scope of this introduction to the underlying science. Likewise, there are huge implications all across psychology and the other sciences that I will likely spend the rest of my life discussing. For now, I'd just like to point out that the emotional palette it draws upon the modern feedback cycle. Now, this is how the 3 levels of information offer an emotional guidance system, a moral compass, if you will, with information that ranges from the deeply universal to the personally tailored, in a stunningly elegant system, to say the least. So here again is that final chart in the paper that I just showed you a minute ago, but this the modern 5-step feedback cycle, but in this slide I've color-coded the emotion with its relevance to the steps in the cycle, because the different levels of emotion have different meaning in different time, in different space and time. So the newest complex emotions are shown in green, the basic emotions in yellow, and in affect are shown in red, which are that relate to the oldest regulatory centers of the brain. The key idea here is to note that the more basic the emotion, the more here and now is its meaning. Note that affect plays a role in each of the 5 steps, as the message within affect concerns the status of the body in its immediate environmental context. It's telling us how well we're honoring the 2 self-regulatory imperatives at any moment in any time. So, but note also that it's the most active in the last 2 steps, the evaluation and the correction, which are embodied in the immediate basic emotions, as they are the original feedback signals and their coupled behavioral urges to approach and avoid. Now note also that they're carried forward, see the red in the first 3 steps, into feed-forward motives, actions, and perceived outcomes due to either conditioned or conscious learning processes. Their emotional messages manifesting as attitudes, beliefs with semantic judgments, and habitual actions, as well as the positive or negative nature of the complex emotions. So this temporal arrangement, the steps of the feedback cycle in time, is key to the definitional categories of emotion as feeling perceptions in the emotional palette, as well as to decoding their meaning. This sequence has also been noted in the coping and emotion regulation literature, by the way, with the first 3 feed-forward steps known as the antecedent-focused coping, and the last 2 known as response-focused coping, in James Gross's work, for example. But perhaps the most important key to decoding the second and third levels of emotional information are the appraisal themes contained within the basic emotion. Now, appraisal themes are essentially the distinct meaning carried within each emotion that comes from a very specific biological function. While appraisal themes have long been central to emotion theory, the significance of their connection to universal human needs, like the needs hierarchy set forth by Maslow, for example, becomes clear in this new self-regulatory view. Indeed, needs are the prime drivers in this new view, for they constitute the internal preset conditions of the thermostat, the hardwired yes-no language of the body and its non-negotiable metabolic requirements. While there is much work to be done in terms of accurately clarifying these needs, the best I've found so far is Maslow's physiological needs and his safety needs. But the safety needs must be expanded to include the primary non-negotiable psychological needs for power and for freedom. These are requirements of our autonomous self-regulatory agency. The ability to move about freely and to make choices to satisfy one's own needs is rooted as deeply as life itself. So these are the basement needs that are followed by the needs to belong, to earn self-esteem, to create, and to find meaning. In short, these needs underlie the information contained in the appraisal themes as they preserve the body proper and drive ongoing self-development of mind. Like the connection between the appraisal themes of emotion and like that connection between the needs, there's also a connection in the appraisal themes to sequential developmental stages, perhaps due to critical windows in the forging and pruning of neurological circuitry as we grow and learn optimal need-meeting strategies and gain cognitive capacities. These need-driven developmental trajectories have so far best been described by Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development and Lawrence Kohlberg's stages of moral development, although to my knowledge the role of emotion was not emphasized in either model. But do note that Erikson's stages are marked by milestones that are often positive or negative emotions, and that Kohlberg's moral reasoning evolves out of simple punishment and reward and matures into egalitarian ethics as empathy develops and one's empathic circle of identity expands over time. All three models, Maslow's needs, Erikson's, and Kohlberg's stages, are wrapped into the appraisal themes of emotion, and understanding these can help us decode the message in each emotion. Still, the optimal trajectory flows from the emotional sensory guidance and yields optimal well-beings and qualities that have been deemed mature executive functions, social intuitions, emotional intelligence, and even spiritual enlightenment. So, with that said, let's introduce the universal appraisal themes within the basic emotions. We've already learned that the core appraisals within affect concern the two self-regulatory purposes, that negative emotions are distress signals bearing messages about physical self-preservation, and that positive eustress signals deliver messages about mindful self-development. But these purposes are also explicit in the hierarchical nature of the needs just described, as needs are the fundamental criteria for the feedback comparisons, our version of the internal settings of the thermostat with a simple yes-no signal if any given need is being sufficiently met. This logic is carried forth in the basic emotions of joy and sadness, which provide immediate feedback concerning gains or losses of need-meeting commodities in the immediate environment. Joy, of course, is about gains and benefits. Sadness is about losses and deficits, ultimately rooted, of course, in thermodynamic energy losses and gains. This is why bipolar joy and sadness serve as the true north and south of the emotional compass. Joy being our true north, wherein simply following our bliss drives the self-developmental process, allowing our inner seeds to flower forth. There are also three more basic emotions, all negatively valenced and all triggering stimulus reducing avoidant behavior: fear, anger, and disgust, all of which subserve the physiological and safety needs in order to preserve our self-regulatory agency and the body proper. The appraisal theme for fear is immediate danger, triggering freezing behavior or the flight mode of avoidance. The appraisal theme for anger is an obstacle to one's agency, as well as social injustice at a higher level, triggering the fight, avoidant responsive behavior. And finally, the theme for disgust is toxic or bacterial contamination, triggering behavioral urges to avoid, remove, or expel the contaminated material. Probably the source of all cleaning behavior, right? Familiar experiences, right? Simple, logical. It's important to know these fundamental biological meanings of these emotions. Otherwise, these basic pains can be culturally massaged into complex emotions. More on this later. Now I want to talk specifically about something I call the negativity ratio, which is why pain is so aversive and why bad is stronger than good in the literature, and why some needs take top priority. You might notice that 4 out of 5 of the basic emotions are negative. This is because they subserve the prime imperative of self-preservation. They are the custodians of Maslow's physiological and safety needs, which are universally non-negotiable across human beings. As such, these basic negative emotions are central mediators of the social contract itself. For example, the need to belong, to have attachments, bonds, and social connections is the threshold need to the higher-tiered needs that concern the biological imperative of self-development, which includes empathic connection to others. But relationships are supposed to facilitate expansion and enhancement of personal agency and self-identity, not its negation or effacement. And to recognize these priorities within your own emotional system, just think of how quickly anger can sweep in like a wet blanket between you and a loved one. In other words, while humans have both individual and social identity components, the individual takes top self-regulatory priority when push comes to shove, just like how your oxygen mask must go on first before you can help another with theirs. Or in more systems language, one cannot have a whole without its parts, or a network without its nodes, or in biological terms, one cannot be an organism without organs and tissues, without each of those being a community of individual cells. So selfish? You bet. Of key importance here, though, is the universal self-correction of all basic emotions is asking us to make changes to the external environment, changes that decrease the eliciting stimulus conditions in order to preserve the integrity of the body. In other words, to avoid self-destruction. And this is true for any body and every body, as it is all about the care and feeding of the body itself, the organism. But this includes the integrity of the social body as well, wherein empathically I know that your pain is my pain, or more sardonically, that your unanswered pains will surely become my pains at some point. So the negativity ratio is actually a very good thing, for nature gifts us, indeed nature offers us, gifts us with 4 times as much information about universally destructive environmental conditions so that we can change them, right? So the messages of pain are to change the landscape. This is why we have the behavioral urges to fight or take flight, to either forcefully change the deficit state conditions in our local environment or simply change our location by running away. But honoring the self-preservationary imperative also includes far more creative kinds of external changes, things that have been going on forever, like cooperative work, because reducing distress is how we build and enhance culture. More on this in a moment. But for now, let me introduce the complex emotions, where the 3rd level of information is to be found. Like secondary colors, the complex emotions are blends and shades of the 5 basic emotions. They're personally tailored feelings, those that are forged through hundreds upon thousands of turns through the trial and error feedback. They unfold over the first decade of life, but their specific eliciting conditions will continue to ebb and flow along with our lifelong development. A key point is that the complex feelings is their full temporal range. They range all across time. Unlike basic feedback signals, they include feed-forward memories, attitudes, and desires. They span across time, dipping into the past and projecting into the future, spanning across space, taking the concept of self-relevant to the far global village, across the entire species. There's also, the complex emotions are also more cognitive, more behaviorally strategic, more trait-like, and more social, in that they often influence our personality and our interpersonal relationships with one another. For example, trust, mistrust, pride, shame, gratitude, contempt, admiration, envy. You get the idea, all of which are intimately familiar and quite specific sorts of emotional experiences, and like I said, all of which are blends and shades of the 5 primary appraisal themes that have been encoded and attached to specific kinds of knowledge systems, beliefs, and behavioral strategies. But most importantly, the self-corrective message of the complex emotions is very different than that of the basic emotions. Complex emotions ask us to make internal changes, to change the mindscape, to maximize adaptive self-development. They ask us to learn, to grow with each new experience, to improve life strategies, build optimal beliefs, and mindful positive attitudes. In fact, this is also the goal of all psychological talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, rational emotive behavior therapy. All of those are asking us to build optimal positive attitudes. Likewise, they ask us to imagine, to create, to invent new and improved need-meeting opportunities and or resources for self and others. Improvements to the mindscape can then be exported to the external physical and social landscape, once again building and enhancing human culture. Complex emotions then are about adaptive self-development, about building both personal mindscapes and social-cultural landscapes in optimal ways. But a key point here is that messages in the complex emotions always concern internal corrections to the personal mindscape first. Any further offerings to the socio-cultural landscape after that are driven exclusively by the complex positive emotions or the 5 basic immediate emotional feedback signals encoded in the basic emotions. So in this new view, these optimal sorts of corrective changes deserve their own mention. They are not mindless fight or flight responses, but mindful right responses, which are about rebalancing or righting the self, like a captain would right his sailboat in response to the winds of change. I also use this term for its moral connotations, as the right response is both the optimal and accountable choice. It's the responsible exercise of one's self-regulatory agency in accordance with one's emotional sensory guidance. No blame, no shame, just going straight to solution. In fact, embracing the information encoded in the feeling signal is itself a right response, as understanding its message is required to follow the simple guidance. From there, it's a matter of simply writing the mindscape or writing the landscape, depending on the specific feeling itself, if it's a basic one or a complex one, and maintaining adherence to this simple, ancient tit-for-tat code to increase the conditions that elicit basic joy and reduce those that elicit the universal pains. These simple self-regulatory rules alone will forge an optimal trajectory over time, building the optimal mix of balanced and fulfilled needs, and ones that will be validated as such by a predominance of the complex positive emotions. Please note that there is no such thing as righteous changes to the landscape that disempower or otherwise interfere with others' rightful self-regulatory agency. In other words, right responses are cooperative, ethically humanitarian, and nonviolent in that they do not intentionally create distress. So while these values and right actions are very simple, the implications are huge. The first of which is that the optimal palette of emotional signals includes the basic emotions, the myriad complex emotions such as courage, compassion, hope, gratitude, etc., but only the four basic negative emotions. We'll address the complex emotions momentarily, along with the startling revelation that they are largely maladaptive human constructions that need never arise with full utilization of the emotional sensory guidance. For now, we've heard about the Losada line and the positivity ratio from Barb Fredrickson, where we need at least 3-to-1 positive to negative emotional experiences to avoid languishing. But this model suggests that when capitalizing upon one's emotional sensory guidance, the optimal ratio is more like 8-to-1, and that flourishing should be the norm. This is why we are so sensitive to context. This is why our emotional sensitivity is increasing. We evolved literally to be in an 8-to-1 positive to negative emotional situation at all times. So in sum, the three levels of information encoded in emotion can represent self-regulatory functioning across the human system. And when I say the function of the emotional sense is self-regulation, that term packs a wallop. It embraces the notions of self-determinism, self-control, self-efficacy, self-esteem, self-transcendence, social identity, and even spirituality, including self-deception and self-delusion, where suffering is indeed the result of our own ignorance and the delusions of the mind. But these are self-destructive outcomes that are due to our suppression and denial rather than our embracing of the emotional information. Overall, the emotional guidance system shows us how to avoid self-destruction, to ensure long-term self-preservation and ongoing self-development, all of which over time yields optimal self-actualization, the manifestation of one's unique genetic potentials and the sharing of those beneficial gifts with humanity, which when accomplished collectively results in an ever-evolving collective human consciousness and human culture as well. Together, these self-regulatory services drive what has been called the upward spiral of positivity, because they're driven by positive feedback, the more kind of optimal change, developing more of the good stuff, the biophysically life-giving, psychosocially need-meeting stuff of life. Do note, however, that downward spirals can predictably occur as well. Fortunately, we have the balancing and stability offered up by the negative feedback signals. These are the stabilizing forces that preserve and replenish the good stuff, like the thermostat dynamics captured in Chip Conley's insightful book, Emotional Equations. It's all about core feedback processes and their elegant binary computations. And this is because feedback loops, switches, and spirals are everywhere performing their self-organizing computational informing functions. It's all there in the mathematically precise behavior of matter in motion. So those are the key insights described in the paper, and they do change quite a bit of what we think we know. So at the end of the paper, I briefly discuss several key implications for morality that fall from this new story of emotion. They are perhaps the easiest portion of the paper to read, so I will very quickly pass over them now, just offering some sound bites to whet the appetite. Indeed, I make some very bold claims, controversial if not offensive or blasphemous, but such is the nature of this work, and to my mind the preponderance of evidence speaks for itself. So, of course, the key implication is that bio-values do exist, and that they are only to be found in emotion, that we can get from an is to an ought, and that living systems figured out how to do so billions of years ago. This new view also shifts morality from the realm of philosophy and religion into the realm of public health, with good and bad feelings relating directly to right and wrong states of self-regulatory balance, based on ancient and non-negotiable imperatives related to the requirements for life itself. So evaluative terms like good, positive, and right are all about optimal health and well-being, and negative, bad, and wrong concern imbalanced states, unanswered emotional messages, and maladaptive, unhealthy, and self-destructive habits. Perhaps even more earth-shaking is to find that the central dichotomy of morality, that of good and evil, is an unsupportable fiction, one born of blaming emotional processes or excluded others for misunderstood emotional dynamics or the outright abuse of the system to garner external forms of behavioral control. Next is that the self is both conceived as a fractal gestalt. The self is best conceived as a fractal gestalt, at once a part and a whole, but with both bottom-up and top-down self-regulatory processes, and individual and social identity components that are elegantly balanced by the emotional sensory system that flows through us with every feeling. The idea that we have a self-regulatory sensory system suggests that morality is a first-person experience rather than a list of social rules or divine commandments, and certainly not a third-party system of coercive bribes and threats of punishment. Next, that nature is not simply red in tooth and claw and only about survival of the fittest, but perhaps even more so green with grace and embrace, that cooperation and adaptive self-development are deeply rooted in our systemic regulatory mechanisms, yet largely left out of evolutionary theory. That sum-zero competition is often the direct result of default fight and flight behavior, power-mongering and or rigid social stratification with the throwback sophistication of primate dominance hierarchies. But that nature is also forgiving, as there's plenty of room for the short-term error required in the trial and error nature of self-regulatory feedback. Our systems are biologically resilient as long as the distress is not ongoing. That there is also an optimal developmental trajectory that results from effective utilization of the emotional sensory guidance. That basic joy takes care of itself as we simply follow our bliss and make the adjustments of the new horizons that unfold before us. That complex positive emotions serving as milestones of balanced being and becoming, the markers of a life well lived. That there is also a wrong track that results from misuse of the emotional system. Indeed, as I hinted before, the entire category of complex negative emotions are social constructions of the wrong kind. Worse, they've been pressed into service in a warped third-party morality, where instead of allowing our emotional guidance to regulate our own behavior and develop our mindscapes, we inflict pain to forcibly regulate one another to conform to our limited perspectives. We often use expressions of disgust or contempt to instill feelings of shame, of guilt, or fear in others to conform to our ethics of divinity or community, respectively. John Haidt's work is instructive here. But this is wrong for many reasons. It not only predicts negative conflicts and downward self-destructive spirals because it defies our self-regulatory nature, it violates the simple ancient imperative of reducing the stimulus conditions of the external environment. In short, we've actively increased the distressing conditions by adding this entire man-made layer of social pain that we attempt to use to regulate one another, but which fails dramatically on every possible measure. This is the actual source of suffering, rather than sin, devils, or evil others. And with what we now know about sensitivity to context, epigenetic switching, and neuroplasty, this is quite literally physically self-destructive, as it interferes with our optimal immune and other cellular regulatory functions. Obviously, there's much more to say here. But this is all actually very good news for psychology, positive psychology, and religion, because we're talking about a hard science biology of virtue. Virtue that is rooted in the good, hard biophysical sciences, yet which comes full circle to the collective wisdom of virtue ethics, moral sentiments, moral reasoning, and emotional intelligence, as well as to the anti-DSM that Marty and the late great Chris Peterson put together. It places concepts like sin and virtue in the context of self-destruction and self-actualization, both of which are fully within our individual control, and all of which revolves around decoding the three levels of information in emotional perceptions, following the clear and simple self-regulatory rules and fostering the complex positive emotions. Indeed, when laundered of all their unfounded Manichaean assumptions and supernatural baggage, the so-called sins and virtues are simply another part of the emotional palette, and the complex positive emotions should be given their due, as George Vaillant suggests in his book Spiritual Evolution. Indeed, in terms of religious virtue, also known as the fruits of spirit in Western tradition, they are all about optimal emotional self-regulation, particularly the positive emotions and all of their accompanying caring, sharing, cooperative, and compassionate behavior. This includes the emotional experience of faith itself, and evolved trust, a certitude that comes with connection to divine potentials through creative inspiration or revelatory transcendent connection to something mystically greater than oneself. But it is an experience rather than a set of doctrines itself. However, this new model allows us to analyze other virtues that have been set forth within a biological light, virtues such as obedience, which often serves to preserve selflessness, right? Which often serves to preserve hierarchical social structures in the name of doctrinal or supernatural authority that often defies and negates our self-regulatory nature, and offers divisive or subpar alternatives. Or virtues such as purity or chastity that dishonor the bodily needs, abuse the basic emotions. Disgust, in particular, has been culturally massaged into feelings of complex contempt, shame, guilt, etc., or the harnessing of the self-preserving imperative to solidify beliefs and attitudes that not only defy the self-developmental purpose, but that justify the normalcy of the complex negative emotions. Indeed, positive emotion lies at the center of all religious traditions. Positive emotions, with its upward developmental spirals of being and becoming, of personal and social well-being, its empathic expansion of identity boundaries to include others, if not enemies, within one's self-relevant sphere. The true North Pole of divine transcendence into compassion, if not spiritual unity, that lies at the center of all religious traditions. Spirituality itself is rooted in emotion. Likewise, in most dictionary definitions, the very words spirit and soul are both described as the animating and vital forces that breathe life into humans or other life forms, and both are explicitly associated with emotion. Look it up. Indeed, even the modern-day mystics and so-called New Age religions, even Tom Cruise's Scientology, are all quite explicit about the role of emotion in spiritual development, healing, and optimal morality, most of which offer an emotional tone scale of some sort, with the general progression from the undesirable complex pains to the sublime complex positive emotions, which are always associated with higher levels of vibration or consciousness. So there's much to be gained here in the experience of spirituality as a category of experience rooted in emotional processes, as opposed to the specific sorts of institutions, doctrines, rituals, and beliefs designed to inspire those experiences. For while the wisdom encoded in emotion is common across all religious traditions, it is neither supernatural nor exclusive. It is humanitarian, and it is the same spiritual wisdom for all members of the global village, with indeed the same ethical values for all living systems. For the emotional sense is as ancient and timeless and natural as life itself. So in conclusion, I hope I've inspired you to rethink your view of emotion. even if it does turn a lot of what we think we know on its head. For the best science suggests that this wondrous system is much bigger, grander, and far more valuable than we've ever imagined. It is nothing less than our natural guidance system and a core component of our very identity. But in closing, I want to suggest that Descartes had it wrong when he declared, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. It is not the thinking mind that defines or exclusively informs us, but a feeling one. And sentio ergo sum, I feel, therefore I am, is much more accurate. Likewise, Bentham and Jeremy Bentham and David Hume had it right. Reason, I kind of flubbed that, didn't I? On the other hand, Bentham and Hume had it right. Reason is and always will be the slave of the passions and not the other way around. The dual process models, those that still want to locate morality in the realm of reason, have already come apart at the seams, as reason alone has no evaluative logos, no biological tether whatsoever without emotion. And Darwin had it right. The man himself had it right from the very start. In one of my favorite of his books, The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals, he offered 3 principles of emotion. He had both the behavioral automaticity and the positive feedback dynamic in his principle of direct action. He had the negative feedback dynamics in his principle of antithesis, and he anticipated the feed-forward dimensions in all Pavlovian conditioned learning process in what he called the principle of serviceable habits. He also endorsed Alexander Bain's fundamental law of pleasure and pain, what he called the principle of I love this, self-conservation, the self-regulating, self-acting impulse of the animal system, unquote. But while limited by the science of his day, Darwin concluded that the language of emotion is certainly of importance to the welfare of mankind, unquote. And I say amen to that. For in terms of morality, a deeper understanding of our emotional sensory guidance bears directly on our very view of human nature. So I offer a more complete version of our now updated Cartesian cogito. Our declaration of the source of our very identity and moral nature would more accurately be sentio ergo sum bonum. I feel, therefore I am good. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening. You can access the paper at this website, and I hope you will read and study the paper carefully. And you're welcome to contact me. Thank you very much.